We all know the story of the fall of Game of Thrones, from one of the greatest fantasy adaptations and television phenomenons of all time to one of the most universally hated disasters of a franchise finale, right next to The Rise of Skywalker. Hey, at least we got Endgame that year. Anyway, ever since the show's infamous conclusion, the showrunners, Dave and Dan, have been widely ridiculed and considered some of the greatest hacks in the writing industry. But while it's obviously true that their talent for adaptation did not carry over into writing wholly original material, I think it's unfair to forget the love and care with which they brought the source material to life in the early seasons of the show. Now, before you comment, I am aware of Season 5. Many of you will argue that Dave and Dan showed their true incompetence and disrespect to Martin's work when they chose not to faithfully adapt A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons in Seasons 5 and 6, instead deviating from the source material to give a heavily abridged version of the events of those books in one season. However, I'm going to defend them in this decision, as I don't believe it was simply a sudden change in their attitude toward the books. I'm not saying their execution was always great, as their own less competent writing started showing as soon as they began making major deviations from Martin's, but the motivation behind their choice makes sense. By the time they began developing Season 5, it had become clear that The Winds of Winter was not going to come out in time for them to adapt it, and Books 4 and 5 spend a ton of time setting up a wide variety of additional new plotlines and characters that Dave and Dan would have had to pay off on their own once they caught up to George. Knowing their own limitations as writers, they made what was probably the wise decision not to adapt most of these new plotlines and characters in order to minimize the number of moving parts they would have to juggle on their own once they ran out of books. Of course, they still managed to fumble what they had regardless, and there's no justification for that, but the fumble likely would have been far more spectacular had they not cut back on the things they had to screw up. So book fans, had Dave and Dan introduced Jon Connington and young Griff, had they not killed off Stannis, had they devoted more time to the plots in Dorne, you probably would have been even more disappointed by the ending.